Came to Grand Lake Stream with my dad and my uncle, my little brother, and his two boys. And the legendary man named Carter White, who was a guide in town and many other things, was our outfitter. And we went for 2 weeks. I had to be in my teens to discover that my parents, my dad and uncle, didn't really have that good a time because it rained every day. But I thought it was magic, and I thought that Carter White was God. He'd say, "Want to see a deer?" And I'd say, "Yeah." And we'd go 10 minutes in his canoe, and there'd be a big buck deer on the shore. "Want to see beaver working on trees?" "Yeah." He'd take me right there. "Want to catch a bunch of perch?" Take me right there. One very vivid and funny memory I have. People said about, there's an old man in town named Donald Chambers who once said to me that anything's good enough for Carter. I said, "What do you mean like that?" By that, he said, "Well, he'll be working on a project and he'll say, 'That's good enough, let's go.' Anything's good enough for Carter." And an example was, we started at the dam, and we went up and through Thoroughfare and up into Dobsey, and then we went up to Dark Cove in Dobsey, and there was a carry from there to Fourth Lake, and that was a bit much for 9 and 7-year-olds and their dads. So Carter had contracted to have somebody come out, I can't remember who, with a flatbed truck. It was a very rough road that went out that way, the Fourth Lake Road, and to pick us up and do the carry. Well, we had been perch fishing that day, and we caught a bunch of perch, and he put them in a bucket. And since it rained, and he knew it was going to rain, he brought on a little jug of coal oil to get a fire started. But of course, it didn't have a stopper in it. That was harder. And obviously, on that ride, as we hit the ruts, the coal oil was jumping into the perch pen. So we get ready for the big fish fry that evening, and Carter got the fat all hot, and he reached in and grabbed one of these fish, and he dropped it, and it went whoosh, that great tower of flame. He never flinched. We all jumped back, and grabbed another one. Hit 3 or 4, and he finally talked to my dad, who was also Sydney. I said, what do you think them's been feeding on, Sid? I remember that, and that was a very vivid memory, and also getting to Fourth Lake, because he had a camp which now belongs to Lee Whiteley, and it had triple bunks in it. And I argued and argued until my dad would let me stay in the upper bunk. I thought that sleep in the top bunk of a triple bunk was just like nothing anybody could ever imagine. So I think he put a whole lot of stuff in there to make sure I didn't fall out of bed. It had a rail, but I think he even built that up. But it was, I just remember coming to this part of the world and kind of having my jaw dropped the whole time. It's a lot different now, with all the kinds of communication that are available to younger people. I know young people who go to, ancient cities in Europe, and, it's familiar territory, at least in a kind of conceptual way. Whereas for me, the first time I went there, it was like the first time I came here. I just looked around. I could not believe anything like this existed on Earth. A couple of summers ago on Munson Island, old folks are always saying the world's going to hell, and it never does entirely. It always was in hell to some degree. But I remember a couple summers ago seeing a younger couple in a tin boat they'd rented somewhere, I guess, off the west shore of Munson Island in the Grand Lake Stream, and they had a couple of boys who were about the same age as I and my brother were when we came here first. And Mom was fishing, Dad was rowing, and the kids were looking at their cell phones and or whatever it was that they had. And I just compared that response to what mine was. The last thing I wanted to do was look here. I wanted to look out there, and that feeling has never left me. I've kind of made my way as a writer, and I think those impressions like that, and also knowing, especially that older generation from Earl older, really shaped me much more than any courses I ever took in school or anything else. You know, I hear those voices all the time in my head, and though I don't write in the way that they spoke or even thought, I'm sure, nonetheless, there's something in the back of my head. I hear the cadences of those voices whenever I write anything, much more profoundly than I do any of the great literary giants of our tradition. The modes of expression, George, as I've said, was the songwriter and the poet, and understood to be the community's best, because back in the old days, up on where the ball field is now, there was a building there, a community building there, and people had to make their own entertainment, so they would periodically have these variety shows. There'd be skits and there'd be music and so on. And when it was time to change scenes, when the curtain came down, George was expected to come out and say what as he would say, that I was expected to say a piece of poetry. And it was mostly satirical, good-natured. The schoolhouse one got him fired from the job when they built the schoolhouse, because he satirized everybody on the crew and everybody from away. That is, with a lot of resentment that the better-paying jobs came from the Boston area. They were not local, and he went in having recited the poem. He went into work the next day on building the schoolhouse, and the boss, a man by the name of Olson, called him in. Said, "I understand you recited quite a poem last night." He said, "Well, I guess probably I did." He said, "Pity I wouldn't have been there to hear it." He said, "Well, you can hear it right now if you want to." So he recited it, and that was the pink slip. He was gone. But he was very voluble, obviously. And his brother, Frank, who lived most of the time out on Wabash Lake in a little cabin out there, which his grandson Teddy now owns, was very understated, laconic. And I remember, this has always struck me as a magnificent example of understatement. He back in Depression days, they had an illegal trap line up a gully on Wabash Lake, and most people were breaking the law to survive. I mean, the area was and is always quasi-depression, but when it was really, really bad, as Earl once said, times got so bad that my dog, Sorry Face, had to lean against a bank to howl. He said, so they had this trap line, and they had a system whereas George would clamber up the top of the ridge, and he'd give a predetermined signal to indicate that all was clear, and then Frank would come up and they'd check that line and so on. And I was visiting over there once, and Frank said they was building a camp. The wardens was building a camp just to catch us fellows. He said, they didn't think we knew they was building it, but we did. And he said, we watched them drive that last nail, and they headed off to town to get their provisions. And this is the line I've always cherished. Time they get back to the camp wasn't no good to them. They burned it right flat to the ground. And he said, George even shot the stove, he says, which was doing something. He says, because bullets were dear. But by the time they got back, their camp wasn't no good to them. I said, boy, that's really, I remember almost rolling on the floor at the perfection of that understatement. Sure, it was George, but toward the end of his life, I still have a camp down on Big Fall on the stream, and he would spend the summer with me and my first wife for quite a few years, probably about 10 years. So I knew him very, very well, and he and I would take off on adventures. We'd go camping together. He particularly loved Third Lake, and we'd go over there a lot. That was back in the day when you had to carry over it. You had to carry from Wabasis Lake over what they called the Stone Dam, and out through the Getchell Pugs, and then into Third Lake. And so we just spent a lot of time kind of knowing one another. And he was such an expansive soul, such a dear soul, and just inherently kind and thoughtful, even though he was a tough little rooster. That's another story, but I only heard it from him, but I heard it verified by one of his contemporaries, Ollie White. He said that when they were in school in Grand Lake Stream, it was now the town office building, the head of the school, the teacher of the school, I mean, it was a mixed classroom, one-room schoolhouse and all that, and the fellow thought it would be a good idea for the kids to learn what the strenuous life, as Teddy Roosevelt called it, and that was his model, what it was all about. So he bought a bunch of boxing gloves, and George beat up everybody in the school, and he said, so then he challenged the teacher, and the teacher decided that boxing was not a good idea after all. I mean, most of the time when I went on, especially on these camping trips with him, most of the time I was just goading him into singing and reciting his poems. And he could go on for hours and hours. And I have a feeling that if you put him on a stage at Carnegie Hall, it wouldn't have fazed him a bit. He'd have loved it. I mean, he was just a born performer. And the repertoire was just beyond belief. There was something else I was about to say when I got thinking about it. Oh, I know. The other thing that I thought was really, really remarkable about George is that, of course, a lot of his stories involved animals, wild and domestic. And when he told you about those animals, he would become that animal. It was uncanny. I don't know exactly how he did it. He told me about raising a pig. He was out when he was a pretty young boy, raising a pig out on Owasis Lake, and he wanted it to be a prize pig. He had heard that if you fed them molasses, they really get big. But unfortunately, he said at that time owned a little bull terrier, and he said that bull terrier is just as nervous as he could be. And he'd look in through the slats at that pig, and he'd jump in, and he'd chase it around and around and around and around, and then he'd get tired and he'd jump out. He said the pig would be looking through the slats at him. He'd jump back in, and then the pig would chase him round and round and round. He said at that time it came to the fair, he said, I butchered that pig. He said he was nothing but gristle and muscle. He had only gained about 15 pounds. He was so fit. And he had another pig story when he had he had built he had his house. Well, he had inherited a house from his father-in-law up near the tower there in town, and his father-in-law was a man named Belding Yates, who came from Prince Edward Island and had worked his way up through the timber management, so he's kind of a straw boss all around here. And George married his daughter, apparently, quite to the chagrin of Belding. And as time went by, George chopped the house up for firewood. So it was way too big for us anyway, even though they had 5 kids. So he gradually chopped it down and eventually moved into this little tar paper shack, which where Robert and Bonnie Gagner live now. At any rate, he had built a hovel for this pig underneath an outbuilding, so that it was it came out from floor level and then went down to grade, and the pig lived essentially under this makeshift wing of the house. And he said he would feed that pig, he said, every day, and he said I didn't have a dog at that time, and he said that one was getting big, And every time I'd feed him, I'd look at him, I said, go it, boy, you're getting big all the time, that's the way, keep feeding. He said, one day, he said, I don't know what would make me do this. He says, the devil just put it in me. He says, he was down there in the trough, and I just lit a cigarette, and I saw them big hairs along his back. I laid the match right on the top of that pig's back, and he never paid any attention, and I began to get alarmed, he says, because it's starting to flame and pop. And he said, all of a sudden, he said, it hit that pig's back, and the pig went woof like that. And he said, when I done that, when he done that, I banged my head on the cross timber to that shed, and he said, I half passed out. And he said, when I come to, that pig was running around and around. He said, the more he'd run, the higher them flames would go. He said, finally he had the good sense to lay down on his back and rub it out the way you'd see a dog do on a carpet someplace. And he said, I come to butcher that pig. He says it was about 4.5 inches, he says, of carbon, right from the top on down. So that was the story. He said, did I ever tell you the one about the day I set the pig afire? I remember his first saying that. Then there's another one that's too, I don't know how long. There we go. George told me, he said, way back many years ago, a man came to work they were doing a logging job close to town, and he was a stranger. He says he worked as hard as anybody, and he was a good worker. He said, but he had a hunchback. They called him Stub. And the trouble with him is that he not only could he not even read or write, but he couldn't tell time either. So the boss bought him an alarm clock, which set the hour so he'd know when to come in for lunch and when to quit for the day. He'd set it on a stump, and of course we'd get down there and we'd fiddle around with it, and he'd be coming in for lunch at 9:30 in the morning and quitting at 8 at night, and so on and so forth. He took it all. He was good-natured about it. Said at the same time, the man that ran the store, which is now the Pine Tree Store, was a man named Robbie Sutherland, who was a famous vanilla drunk and had a cleft palate. And he says he didn't talk plain. You could understand him if you lived here long enough. He said he's hard to understand for strangers. Well, he lived down on the river with a woman named Mrs. Hawkins. And he said she was quite a drinker too, and when they get too drunk, he said, they get fighting and the fur would certainly fly. So one night, apparently, Robbie said something to her she didn't like, so she picked up a big old clock that was standing there on a shelf and took him right between the eyes. Next day, he come into the store, and he wasn't feeling very good anyway. He had a big bandage around his head where she had struck him. Just about then, the alarm clock went off for Stubb, and he came wandering up to the store. He opened the screen and looked in, and he says, hey, storekeeper, he says, what time is it? Robbie looked at him and he says, go to hell, you humpback son of a bitch. I incorporated that into that novel. And I incorporated a lot of, that was the one and only, thereafter I